The origins of the classical school have its place in a variety of ideas and movements that impacted the way history was practiced in the United States, England, and continental Europe. The reason the classical school is important is that it was the first historical intellectual movement to professionalize the practice of history. In essence, to create a set of guidelines and criteria by which historians have utilized since the early 19th century. What sets the era of professional history apart from previous generations and centuries is the fact that from the ancient Greeks on through the 18th century, there were no standards for conducting research or consensus for what constituted proper history. Individuals, groups, and movements introduced ideas that would come in and out of fashion. From time to time, writers and philosophers believed that history worked in cycles, repeating itself. Others believed that history was the result of divine intervention, and thus the history of humankind was one of divine providence. And others believed human history operated on a linear track, which offered no overall explanations. Sometimes these ideas predominated the period, other times these ideas competed with each other. As a result, history as a discipline suffered, and did not hold the esteem that philosophy or literature would during that time. The emergence of the first professional school of history came about due to new ideas about history and its practice, which first emerged in the 18th century. Let's look at those original ideas which predate the classical school of history. The first pre-classical school idea emerges from a group of people some refer to as the erudites. They were a group of 17th and 18th century philosophers, writers, as well as scholars connected to civic and ecclesiastical institutions. They emerged in Germany, Italy, and France, and they did not write histories as we recognize them today. They recorded, cataloged, and published primary documents. They were really interested in authenticating historical documents, which during that time many people fabricated documents and circulated them throughout Europe. They hoped that these efforts at preservation and authentication would help people understand the nature of events by forcing writers to consider unique events and individuals that fit into a larger whole. It was rare for them to write any narrative history, and they were usually tied to some institution such as a church or government body, which limited their intellectual freedom to explore ideas contrary to the wishes of their employers. Usually their work was meant solely to support the efforts of their patrons and employers. Their importance to the study of history was in their advocacy of primary documents to understand history. Before this time, it was rare for a writer to use primary documents, so myths and legends oftentimes made it into those early histories. The erudites wanted writers to consult the recorded record. Let's take a look at the next idea, progressivism or positivism, what's known as progress as history. This is an idea that emerged in the 17th century and became popular in the 18th century. It is the idea that God or divine providence created the world and set humankind on its path. However, through history, rationality freed humankind to travel on its own destiny, one of greater achievement, freedom, and liberty, and of course, greater rationality. Thus, according to these philosophers, a study of history between 2 points in time would reflect greater progress and perfection. This contradicted both the cyclical approach to history, as well as the idea that there was divine intervention in history, since to these thinkers, history traveled on a straight line toward betterment. Now let's move on to the empiricists. These are a group of English and European philosophers who believe phenomena happen for a reason. They emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries and embodied the idea that the natural world could be explained through a thorough examination of evidence by the senses. This coincided with the scientific revolution. Thus, if an event happened, it can be examined and explained through empiricism. One of the most prominent was Francis Bacon, who believed that knowledge should be derived from observations of the material world. Finally, the emergence of the nation-state. When examining these groups of historians, most people overlook the profound political and diplomatic transformations of Europe and the Americas during this time. Through this period, writers and philosophers were responding to the emergence of the nation-state. What started with England, Portugal, and Spain in the early modern period now moved to the United States, and France, which was a nation-state, transformed itself due to social revolution. When this school of historians emerged, both Germany and Italy were organizing into nation-states. For all of these countries forming newly or even sustained nations, history was an important medium to transmit national legitimacy as an independent, unified people whose history predated the nation by centuries. It also had the added feature of promoting a people who, with a common language, culture, and geography, also shared a history. It is easy to look back now at their writings and call it propaganda. However, these writers and philosophers were not like the erudites, whose livelihood was tied to a patron or institution. They instead believed in their national pride and operated in the spirit that their words reflected the passions of their fellow countrymen. The classical school of historians. Now let's discuss this school in general terms and then move on to specific schools in specific countries. There are actually numerous names for these founding groups of professional historians. Some refer to them as the empiricists, others call them the German school. Many books refer to them as practicing historicism. Many of these terms are specific to German and English philosophies to history and do not take into account what happened in other countries. So it would be better to refer to this generation of historians all as the classical school of historiography, which represents the writers and scholars who took history from practice, professionalized it, and brought it to the universities as a separate discipline from philosophy and literature. The confusion with this term is that it uses classical, which often refers to scholars of the ancient world like Greece and Rome. They call themselves classicists. Just remember that the classical school are the early 19th century historians, and classicists are scholars of ancient Greece and Rome. Now let's examine how some of these ideas were shared and disputed between Germany, France, England, and the United States. Let's start with Germany, because that's really where the classical school begins. The German school was the first to emerge and really impacted all of the other schools that we'll discuss later. Now, we discussed originally the broader ideas that impacted these classical schools, such as the erudites, the empiricists, and the emergence of the nation-state. In Germany, there were two important intellectual movements taking place that we need to discuss to understand where and why the German school emerged. The first were the German classicists. The second was Wilhelm Hegel and the idea of the spirit. Let's look at the German classicists first. The German school of classical history emerged as a result of German classicists who wanted to transform the study of ancient Greece and Rome. At the time, classicists in Germany were primarily interested in language. But a group of classicists broadened their studies to include history, politics, art, culture, and the economy of the ancient world in order to understand a fuller picture of life during that time. What that opened up were new questions, interpretations, and critical analysis of the field that had never existed before. And many of the historians who would emerge in the German school started out studying these classicists. Hegel's philosophies, specifically the idea of the spirit, were influential to these historians. Hegel believed that established order existed through what we might describe as a thesis. And there was a force against that established order that we could call the antithesis. From the struggle between the thesis and the antithesis emerged the spirit,